The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the USS Arizona, as Seaman First Class James Richardson scrubbed the wooden planks with methodical precision. It was December 6, 1941, and the massive battleship sat peacefully, anchored in Pearl Harbor alongside 7 other dreadnoughts of the United States Pacific Fleet. Richardson paused, wiping sweat from his brow as he gazed across the tranquil waters toward Ford Island. The air was thick with tropical humidity, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against the hull, and the distant calls of seabirds circling overhead. 1,200 miles to the northwest, however, a very different scene was unfolding. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his weathered face etched with concern as he studied the meteorological reports. The Japanese First Air Fleet, consisting of 6 aircraft carriers and their escorts, had been battling rough seas for days as they approached their target. The storm that had plagued their journey was finally subsiding, but Nagumo knew that success depended on perfect timing and absolute surprise. The roots of this impending confrontation stretched back decades, intertwining the destinies of 2 Pacific powers in an increasingly complex web of territorial ambition and economic necessity. Japan's rapid industrialization following the Meiji Restoration of 1868 had transformed the island nation from a feudal society into a modern military power with imperial aspiration. By the 1930s, Japan's population had swelled to over 70 million people crammed onto islands, with limited natural resources, creating an urgent need for raw materials and living space that would drive the nation toward aggressive expansion. The situation had been steadily deteriorating since Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, followed by the full-scale war with China that erupted in 1937. As reported in contemporary analyses by the New York Times, American public opinion had grown increasingly hostile toward Japanese aggression, particularly after the shocking Nanking Massacre and the deliberate bombing of civilian targets in Chinese cities. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration responded with a series of economic sanctions and embargoes designed to pressure Japan into withdrawing from its conquered territories. The final straw came in July 1941 when Japanese forces occupied French Indochina, prompting Roosevelt to freeze all Japanese assets in the United States and impose a complete oil embargo. This action, coordinated with Britain and the Dutch East Indies, effectively cut off Japan's access to 80% of its oil imports. For a nation whose military machine and industrial economy depended entirely on imported petroleum, this represented an existential threat that demanded immediate action. Emperor Hirohito's government faced an agonizing choice: submit to American demands and abandon their hard-won empire in China, or strike decisively before their strategic reserves were exhausted. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, a former general who had risen to power in October 1941, advocated for war despite the enormous risks involved. The Japanese military estimated they had sufficient oil reserves for perhaps 18 months of warfare, making speed and surprise absolutely critical to any chance of success. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had initially opposed war with America, famously warning that Japan might run wild for 6 months or a year, but could not sustain a prolonged conflict against American industrial might. However, once the decision for war was made, Yamamoto threw himself into planning the most audacious naval attack in history, recognizing that Japan's only hope lay in delivering a knockout blow that would cripple American naval power in the Pacific and force a negotiated settlement. The concept that would become Operation Hawaii began to crystallize in Yamamoto's mind. During the spring of 1941, the admiral had spent years studying American naval capabilities and had concluded that the United States Pacific Fleet, concentrated at Pearl Harbor since May 1940, represented the greatest threat to Japanese expansion in Southeast Asia. If Japan was to secure the oil-rich Dutch East Indies and establish a defensive perimeter across the Central Pacific, the American battleships anchored in Hawaiian waters would have to be eliminated. Yamamoto's plan was breathtakingly ambitious in its scope and complexity. Rather than attempting to lure the American fleet into the decisive battle that Japanese naval doctrine traditionally favored, he proposed to strike Pearl Harbor itself with a massive carrier-based air assault. The attack would need to be coordinated, with simultaneous offensives against American, British, and Dutch territories throughout the Pacific. Requiring unprecedented levels of planning and secrecy, the technical challenges were formidable. Pearl Harbor's shallow depth of approximately 45 feet meant that conventional aerial torpedoes would simply bury themselves in the harbor floor, rather than striking their targets. Japanese engineers worked feverishly to modify their type. 91 torpedoes with wooden stabilizing fins that would allow them to run in shallow water. Meanwhile, armor-piercing bombs capable of penetrating thick battleship deck armor had to be improvised. By converting 16-inch naval artillery shells, Commander Minoru Genda, Yamamoto's brilliant tactical planner, spent months studying Pearl Harbor's defenses and developing attack procedures. Intelligence gathered by Japanese consular officials in Honolulu, particularly Consul General Nagao Kita and his spy Takeo Yoshikawa, provided detailed information about American ship movements, patrol schedules, and defensive preparations. Yoshikawa, operating under the cover of a diplomatic visa, had systematically observed Pearl Harbor from various vantage points around Oahu, noting that American warships typically returned to port on weekends and that aerial patrols were conducted primarily to the south and west, as documented in declassified Japanese naval records. The First Air Fleet began intensive training in September 1941. Pilots practiced low-level bombing runs and torpedo attacks at Kagoshima Bay, which bore a resemblance to Pearl Harbor's topography. The training was conducted under conditions of absolute secrecy, with aircrews told only that they were preparing for a major operation against an unspecified enemy port. Even squadron commanders remained unaware of their actual target until the fleet had already departed Japanese waters. The diplomatic situation provided perfect cover for Japanese preparations. While Admiral Nagumo's task force gathered at the remote anchorage of Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands, Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu was dispatched to Washington to join Ambassador Kichi Saburo Nomura in supposedly earnest negotiations with Secretary of State Cordell Hull. These talks, which would continue right up until the moment of attack, were designed to lull American suspicions while Japanese forces moved into position. President Roosevelt and his military advisors were certainly aware that war might be imminent. American cryptographers had partially broken Japanese diplomatic codes and were intercepting communications that suggested aggressive intentions. However, most intelligence analysts believed that Japan would strike first at British or Dutch territories in Southeast Asia rather than risk provoking American entry into the war through a direct attack on United States territory. The final decision to proceed with the Pearl Harbor attack was made at an imperial conference on December 1, 1941. Emperor Hirohito, after listening to hours of debate among his military and civilian advisors, gave his consent to begin hostilities. The coded message climbed Mount Nitaka was transmitted to Admiral Nagumo, confirming that the attack would proceed as planned. There would be no turning back. Dawn broke gray and cold over Hitokapu Bay on November 26, 1941, as the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled prepared to depart on its historic mission. Admiral Nagumo's task force, designated Kido Butai, consisted of 6 aircraft carriers escorted by the fast battleships to heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zukaku together embarked for 114 aircraft, including 143 Nakajima B-5NK torpedo bombers, 131 Aichi D-3A Valdive bombers, and 40 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. The departure had been timed to coincide with a massive storm front that would provide natural camouflage from American reconnaissance flights and merchant shipping. As the fleet formed into cruising formation and headed northeast into the empty expanses of the North Pacific, Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, the air group commander who would lead the actual attack, gathered his pilots for a final briefing aboard the flagship Akagi. The target was revealed at last: Pearl Harbor, home port of the United States Pacific Fleet. The reaction among the aviators was a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Many had trained for months without knowing their ultimate destination, and the revelation that they would be striking the American naval base sent waves of nervous energy through the ready rooms. Fukuda, a veteran pilot with over 3,000 flight hours, understood the magnitude of what they were attempting. Success would require perfect coordination among hundreds of aircraft launching from 6 different carriers, while maintaining complete radio silence until the moment of attack. Navigation proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of the 11-day voyage. The task force was following a route far to the north of normal shipping lanes, where rough seas and frequent storms made accurate position fixing extremely difficult. Commander Minoru Jinna had calculated that they needed to approach to within 230 miles of Oahu to ensure that their aircraft had sufficient fuel for the return journey. But getting to that precise point without being detected required extraordinary seamanship. The weather remained consistently foul throughout the first week of December, with mountainous swells and driving rain that made flight operations impossible. Several destroyers suffered damage from the heavy seas, and there were moments when Admiral Nagumo considered whether the mission should be aborted. However, the storm that made their journey so miserable also provided perfect concealment from American patrols, and by December 5th the seas had begun to moderate as the fleet approached Hawaiian waters. As reported in subsequent Japanese naval histories, the most tense moment of the voyage came on December 3rd when the fleet encountered the American merchant vessel SS Lurline traveling from Honolulu to San Francisco. The passenger liner passed within visual range of the Japanese formation, and for several agonizing minutes, it appeared that their presence might be reported to American authorities. However, the Lurline continued on its course without any indication that Japanese warships had been spotted, and the task force maintained its approach toward Pearl Harbor. The final intelligence update was received via radio on December 6th, confirming that the major units of the Pacific Fleet remained anchored in Pearl Harbor as expected. 8 battleships, numerous cruisers and destroyers, and various auxiliary vessels were present, though unfortunately the 3 aircraft carriers USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga were all at sea on various missions. Yamamoto had particularly hoped to catch the American carriers in port, recognizing their importance to future Pacific operations, but the battleships remained the primary objective. By the evening of December 6th, the Japanese fleet had reached its launching position approximately 275 miles north of Oahu. The sea had calmed to a moderate swell, and weather conditions were nearly perfect for flight operations. Admiral Nagumo gave the order to commence preparations for the attack, and throughout the night, aircraft were brought up from the hangar decks armed with torpedoes and bombs, and spotted on the flight decks in preparation for launch. The moment that would change the course of world history was now less than 12 hours away. The pre-dawn darkness of December 7th, 1941, hung heavy over the Pacific as the Japanese carriers turned into the wind to begin launching their aircraft. Admiral Nagumo had positioned his task force approximately 230 miles north of Pearl Harbor, close enough to ensure his planes could reach their target with adequate fuel reserves. For the return journey, the sea was running a moderate swell with winds of 24 knots from the northeast, nearly perfect conditions for carrier operations. At 5:30 in the morning, Hawaii time, the first wave of aircraft began launching from the 6 carriers. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, leading the attack from his Kate torpedo bomber, watched as 183 aircraft rose from the flight decks and formed into attack formation. The first wave consisted of 49 Kate bombers armed with modified torpedoes, 40 Kate high-level bombers carrying armor-piercing bombs, 51 Val-dive bombers, and 43 Zero fighters. As dawn began to break over the Pacific, this aerial armada set course for Oahu, flying at an altitude of 3,000 feet to avoid detection by American radar. Meanwhile, at Pearl Harbor, the morning of December 7th had begun like any other peaceful Sunday. Aboard the USS Arizona, Seaman Richardson was preparing for church services scheduled for 11 o'clock. The massive battleship, commissioned in 1916 and displacing over 31,000 tons, was moored alongside Ford Island in what the sailors called Battleship Row. 7 other dreadnoughts were anchored nearby: USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Nevada, USS Tennessee, USS Maryland, and USS Pennsylvania. The tranquil morning routine was briefly interrupted at 6:30 when the destroyer, USS Ward, patrolling the harbor entrance, attacked and sank a Japanese midget submarine attempting to infiltrate Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant William Outerbridge reported the incident to headquarters, but in the confusion of peacetime bureaucracy, the significance of this encounter was not immediately recognized. It would later be understood as the first shot of the Pacific War, fired over an hour before the main attack began. At exactly 7:35, Fukuda's formation approached the northern coast of Oahu. and split into predetermined attack groups. The commander surveyed the scene below through his binoculars and felt a surge of elation. The American fleet was exactly where Japanese intelligence had predicted. With 8 battleships moored into neat rows along Ford Island, there were no signs of unusual alert status, no combat air patrols overhead, and no evidence that the Americans suspected anything unusual. As documented in official U.S. Navy records, the first indication of trouble came at 7:40 when Ensign Joseph Taussig aboard the USS Nevada spotted aircraft approaching from the northwest, initially assuming they were American planes conducting training exercises. Taussig was puzzled by their unfamiliar silhouettes and the fact that no flights had been scheduled for Sunday morning. His confusion turned to horror as he saw the distinctive red circle emblems on the wings and realized these were Japanese aircraft diving toward the harbor. The first bombs fell on Ford Island at 7:55, striking the Naval Air Station and destroying aircraft parked in neat rows on the tarmac. Simultaneously, Cape torpedo bombers swept in at masthead height, their pilots threading between moored vessels to launch their deadly weapons at the battleships. The modified torpedoes, fitted with wooden fins to function in shallow water, ran true and struck their targets with devastating effect. USS Oklahoma was hit by 3 torpedoes within the first few minutes of the attack and immediately began listing heavily to port. The crew's efforts to counterflood and save their ship were hampered by the loss of electrical power, and within 20 minutes the 31,000-ton battleship had capsized completely, trapping over 400 sailors inside her hull. USS West Virginia absorbed 7 torpedo hits and began settling by the stern, her commanding officer Captain Mervyn Benyon mortally wounded by shrapnel from a bomb hit. On the nearby USS Tennessee, the USS Arizona, positioned inboard of the repair ship USS Vestal, was initially struck by the armor-piercing bombs that caused significant but not fatal damage. However, at 8:06, a converted 16-inch artillery shell dropped by a Cape bomber penetrated the battleship's forward magazine. The resulting explosion, visible from 20 miles away, lifted the entire forward section of the ship out of the water and broke her back. Within 9 minutes, the Arizona had settled to the harbor bottom, taking 1,177 officers and men to their deaths. The explosion of the USS Arizona sent a towering column of black smoke, an orange flame nearly 1,000 feet into the air, creating a funeral pyre that could be seen from every corner of Oahu. The blast was so powerful that it lifted men off their feet on ships hundreds of yards away and shattered windows in Honolulu, 7 miles distant. For the Japanese pilots circling overhead, it was confirmation that their surprise attack had achieved complete tactical success. Commander Fukuda, coordinating the assault from his aircraft high above the harbor, transmitted the code words Tora, Tora, Tora to Admiral Nagumo at 8:15, confirming that complete surprise had been achieved. Below him, Pearl Harbor had been transformed into a scene of incredible destruction and chaos. 5 of the 8 battleships were either sinking or severely damaged. Oil fires spread across the water's surface, and the air was filled with the acrid smoke of burning fuel and exploding ammunition. The USS Oklahoma had completely capsized. By 8:08, her hull protruding from the water like the back of a beach whale. Desperate rescue efforts were already underway as sailors and civilians attacked the steel plating with cutting torches, trying to reach men trapped in air pockets within the overturned hull. Over the next 36 hours, they would succeed in cutting through to 32 survivors, but more than 400 of Oklahoma's crew had perished in the attack. USS West Virginia was settling by the stern, her decks awash as damage control parties fought to keep her from capsizing like her sister ship. The battleship's commanding officer, Captain Mervyn Benyon, lay dying on the bridge from shrapnel wounds, but continued giving orders for the defense of his ship until he succumbed to his injuries. Mess Attendant Doris Miller, an African-American sailor who had been collecting laundry when the attack began, helped move the wounded captain to safety before manning an anti-aircraft gun. Despite having no training on the weapon, the second wave of Japanese aircraft, 171 planes under the command of Lieutenant Commander Shikakazu Shimazaki, arrived over Pearl Harbor at 8:54. This formation consisted primarily of Val dive bombers and Zero fighters, tasked with attacking targets that had survived the first assault. However, by this time American defenses were fully alert, and the second wave encountered much heavier anti-aircraft fire than their predecessors. USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, became a magnet for Japanese bombers. As she attempted to reach the harbor entrance, the ship's crew, led by Ensign Joseph Tausig and Chief Boatswain Edwin Hill, had managed to slip her moorings and build up steam in record time. As Nevada moved slowly down the harbor channel, she drew concentrated attacks from dive bombers determined to sink her in the narrow passage that blocked the harbor entrance. Multiple bomb hits along Nevada's length caused severe damage and started fierce fires, but the gallant battleship continued her attempt to reach open water. Realizing that the ship might sink in the channel if she continued, Harbor Control ordered Nevada to beach herself at Hospital Point rather than risk blocking Pearl Harbor's entrance. The grounding was executed perfectly, and though Nevada was heavily damaged, she had avoided the fate that befell her sister ships. As recorded in official U.S. Army records, the attack extended far beyond Pearl Harbor itself. Japanese bombers struck Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Bellows Field, and other military installations around Oahu, destroying most of the island's aircraft on the ground. The obsolescent Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighters and Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers were caught completely unprepared, parked in neat rows that made perfect targets for strafing runs. At Hickam Field, adjacent to Pearl Harbor, 35 aircraft were destroyed and another 6 damaged beyond repair. The base hospital was hit by a bomb that killed medical personnel. Tending to wounded sailors from the harbor, Wheeler Field in central Oahu lost 40 to aircraft, while Bellows Field on the eastern coast saw most of its small fighter contingent destroyed on the ground. Only a handful of American pilots managed to get airborne during the attack, and they faced overwhelming odds against the experienced Japanese aviators. By 10 o'clock, the last Japanese aircraft were departing Pearl Harbor and heading back toward their carriers. The attack had lasted less than 2 hours, but it had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific. 8 American battleships had been sunk or severely damaged. 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers had suffered significant damage, and over 180 aircraft had been destroyed. Most importantly, 2,403 American servicemen and civilians had lost their lives, with another 1,178 wounded in the surprise attack. As the sound of aircraft engines faded into the distance, an eerie silence settled over Pearl Harbor, broken only by the crackling of fires and the desperate shouts of rescue parties working to save trapped sailors. The harbor that had awakened to peaceful Sunday morning sunshine was now shrouded in thick black smoke that would continue burning for days. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, stood on the submarine base dock surveying the devastation with tears streaming down his face, knowing that his career and the lives of thousands of men under his command had been shattered in less than 2 hours. The human cost of the attack was staggering. Aboard the USS Arizona alone, 1,177 officers and men had perished, including Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd and Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg, both of whom were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The USS Oklahoma had lost 415 members of her crew, while smaller numbers had died aboard other vessels and at the various airfields around Oahu. The attack had created more American casualties in a single morning than any previous event in the nation's peacetime history. Rescue operations began immediately, with sailors, civilians, and military personnel from all branches working together to save lives and fight fires. The most dramatic rescue efforts focused on the overturned hull of the USS Oklahoma, where tapping sounds indicated that men were still alive in air pockets. Within the capsized battleship, Navy salvage expert Commander Edward Raymer led cutting parties that worked around the clock with acetylene torches, eventually freeing 32 survivors over the next 36 hours. The attack had achieved most of Admiral Yamamoto's tactical objectives. The American battle line had been effectively eliminated as a fighting force, with 5 battleships sunk and 3 others severely damaged. However, the Japanese had failed to locate and destroy the Pacific Fleet's 3 aircraft carriers, which were fortunately at sea when the attack occurred. The USS Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. The USS Lexington was ferrying aircraft to Midway, and the USS Saratoga was in San Diego undergoing maintenance. More significantly, from a strategic perspective, the Pearl Harbor attack had accomplished something that years of political debate had failed to achieve. It united the American people behind total war against Japan. As news of the sneak attack spread across the United States, the isolationist sentiment that had dominated American politics for 2 decades evaporated overnight. The attack on what President Roosevelt would call a date which will live in infamy had transformed American public opinion and guaranteed that the United States would enter World War II with its full industrial and military might committed to victory, as documented in contemporary newspapers. Initial reports of the attack were met with disbelief by many Americans who simply could not accept that Japan had dared to strike directly at United States territory. The New York Times reported that many citizens first assumed the radio broadcasts were another fictional drama, like Orson Welles' famous War of the Worlds broadcast of 1938. However, as confirmation arrived from multiple sources, shock gave way to a burning desire for revenge that would sustain the American war effort. Through 4 years of global conflict, the Japanese task force was already racing back toward home waters, having accomplished their mission with remarkably light losses. Only 29 aircraft had been shot down during the attack, with 55 aviators killed, a casualty rate of less than 7%. Admiral Nagumo had initially considered launching a third wave to target Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks and repair facilities, but concern about American counterattacks and the need to preserve his force for future operations led him to withdraw. While victory was assured, the decision not to attack the fuel farm would prove to be a critical strategic error. Pearl Harbor's tank farms contained over 4.5 million barrels of precious fuel oil that would be essential for American naval operations in the coming war. Had these storage facilities been destroyed, the Pacific Fleet would have been forced to operate from bases on the American West Coast, effectively ceding control of the Central Pacific to Japan for months or even years. Similarly, the failure to target Pearl Harbor's dry docks and repair facilities meant that damaged American ships could be restored to service much more quickly than Japanese planners had anticipated. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was having lunch at his desk in the Oval Office when Navy Secretary Frank Knox burst in with the first fragmentary reports of the Pearl Harbor attack. The president's initial reaction was one of stunned disbelief despite mounting tensions with Japan. He had not expected such a direct and devastating assault on American territory. As additional reports confirmed the scope of the disaster, Roosevelt's shock gave way to grim determination. The United States was now at war, and there could be no turning back. The following day, December 8, 1941, Roosevelt appeared before a joint session of Congress to request a declaration of war against Japan. His speech, broadcast live to the nation, contained some of the most memorable words in American political history. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The vote for war was nearly unanimous, with only Representative Jeannette Rankin of Montana dissenting. The transformation of American society was immediate and profound. Within days of Pearl Harbor, recruitment offices were overwhelmed by volunteers eager to avenge the attack. Young men who had shown little interest in military service suddenly found themselves consumed by patriotic fervor and a desire to strike back at Japan. The attack had provided a clear and unambiguous enemy that united Americans across regional, ethnic, and political lines in a way that no abstract ideological conflict could have achieved. Industrial mobilization began immediately as American factories switched from consumer goods to war production. The massive industrial capacity that had been underutilized during the Great Depression was suddenly redirected toward building the ships, aircraft, and weapons that would be needed to fight a global war. Within months, the United States was producing military equipment at rates that would have seemed impossible before Pearl Harbor, validating Admiral Yamamoto's warnings about America's industrial potential. The psychological impact of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond American shores. Throughout the Pacific, news of the successful attack convinced many that Japanese military might was irresistible. The swift conquest of the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies that followed seemed to confirm that the rising sun was indeed ascending to dominate the Pacific. However, the attack had also awakened a sleeping giant whose fury would prove far more devastating than anything Japanese militarists had anticipated. For the families of those killed at Pearl Harbor, the transformation was deeply personal. Gold Star mothers who had lost sons in the attack became symbols of American sacrifice and determination. The Arizona alone had created over 1,000 widows and fatherless children, their personal tragedies embodying the larger national loss. Memorial services were held across the country as Americans struggled to comprehend the scale of what had happened and what it would mean for the future. The strategic consequences of Pearl Harbor would unfold over the following 4 years as the United States mobilized for total war against Japan and Germany. The Pacific Fleet, though temporarily crippled, would be rebuilt with new classes of fast battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, and destroyers that would ultimately prove superior to their Japanese counterparts. The carrier aviation that Japan had used so effectively at Pearl Harbor would be turned against them with interest, as American industrial might produce thousands of aircraft and trained pilots. Admiral Yamamoto's prediction that Japan might run wild for 6 months or a year proved remarkably accurate. The 6 months following Pearl Harbor saw Japanese forces achieve victory after victory across the Pacific, but the tide began to turn at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Wherefore the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were sunk by American dive bombers. The path from that devastating surprise attack to ultimate Japanese surrender. Aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, would be paved with the sacrifice and determination that Pearl Harbor had ignited in the American people. The attack on Pearl Harbor had accomplished its immediate tactical objectives while failing catastrophically in its strategic purpose. Instead of intimidating the United States into a negotiated settlement, it had unified American resolve and guaranteed that the war would continue until Japan's complete and unconditional surrender, December 7, 1941, would indeed live in infamy, but not in the way Admiral Yamamoto and the Japanese leadership had intended. This story draws upon extensive historical documentation, including official U.S. Navy records, the classified Japanese naval archives, and contemporary newspaper accounts to present an accurate portrayal of the events leading up to and during the Pearl Harbor attack.